I'm Floyd Cheung, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Professor of English and American Studies at Smith College. Over the years, I've edited several volumes by and about forgotten and lesser-known Asian American writers, mainly between the 1880s and the 1960s. This work of recovery has been my attempt to diversify and deepen the American literary canon. By paying attention to these literary voices, I hope to build a more inclusive communal imagination of who counts as American. Most recently, I worked with Frank Abe to edit The Literature of Japanese American Incarceration, an anthology of first-person accounts, poems, and fiction by those who experienced the internment, or what we now call the incarceration, during World War II. Technically, the word internment applies to those deemed to be prisoners of war. In fact, the U.S. government did not make that determination regarding most of the more than 125,000 people that it rounded up based on race alone. While a few Japanese nationals were interned along with Germans and Italians living in America, the vast majority of Japanese and Japanese Americans, who were citizens, did not go through a process to determine loyalty or culpability before the government summarily imprisoned them behind barbed wire. That's why we call it incarceration now. While incarcerees all faced the same injustice, they did not all respond in the same way. In addition, the incarceration and its aftermath unfolded over many years and went through various phases. Hence, in the anthology, Frank and I juxtaposed differing points of view and arranged the works chronologically in order to provide readers with a sense of both complexity of reaction in any given moment and development over time. The first moment, of course, is Before Camp, which is the title of Part 1. In the earliest section of the book, Arrival and Community, we sought to paint a picture of life for Japanese Americans during the early 20th century. In the section named Arrest and Alien Internment, we sought to convey how surprised Japanese Americans were when they learned of the Imperial Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The character in Shelley Ayame Nishirama Ota's novel puts it well. Those airplanes outside aren't ours. Everyone, including the college-aged John Okada, feared the consequences of this attack on the lives of Japanese Americans. Long before he wrote the novel No Boy, John Okada anonymously published a poem entitled I Must Be Strong. We decided to include 5 selections on the U.S. Roundup of Japanese American elders and leaders, because this stage of wartime experience is sometimes conflated with the mass removal of Japanese American populations from the West Coast. In the days and weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor, many business owners, teachers, priests, and other community leaders were literally interned, that is, imprisoned as alien threats to the state during a time of war. The next section, Cooperation and Refusal, kicks off with Executive Order 9066, the first of several government documents in the volume. In my own teaching at Smith College, I ask my students to think about literary selections as reactions to such documents. So Frank and I sought to recreate the conditions for dialogic study in our volume. Hence, Japanese American voices of both principled refusal as well as accommodationist cooperation follow the executive order. This leads us to the heart of the book, Part 2, simply called The Camps. We entitled the first section of this part, Fairgrounds and Racetracks, to remind readers that these sites within city limits were the hosts of so-called assembly centers. Our selections here reflect the many emotions felt by Japanese Americans at this early moment in their unfolding experience. They did not know what was going to happen to them or how long the war would last. Confusion and doubt coexisted with resolution and readiness. A longer section entitled Deserts and Swamps focuses on the various locations and conditions of the 10 main camps, which the government euphemistically called relocation centers. Recent scholars of incarceration have pointed attention to the fact that many of these centers were built on or adjacent to Native American reservations. Hence, some of our selections include references to Japanese American and Native American interaction. Content warnings should accompany most sections of the anthology, but they are especially pertinent here, since some selections mention rape, the shooting of incarcerees, and other events that Cherry Tanaka wryly calls unpleasantness. While some certainly girded themselves with an attitude of endurance, others actively resisted. The book cover image that Frank and I chose depicts a protest by Japanese Americans at the camp in Poston by Disney illustrator turned incarceree, Jean Sogioka. The full text of the government document, commonly called the Loyalty Questionnaire, kicks off the section entitled Registration and Segregation. Most students of incarceration are familiar with questions 27 and 28 about whether one is willing to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces and willing to forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. We wanted to reprint the entire questionnaire so that readers could ascertain what Japanese American incarcerees had to grapple with. The incarcerees at Topaz, for instance, refused to fill out the form until the government answered their questions about it, and we reprint their reasoning. Ultimately, this poorly conceived and confusingly written questionnaire created rifts within the Japanese American community in each camp, and sometimes within families. The literature of this section gives us a sense of the diversity of reactions and attendant consequences. In the next section, Volunteers and the Draft, we share the work of those who believe that fighting for the U.S. would be a sign of loyalty. But we also encounter the voices of mothers who insisted on knowing that their sons' lives would not be spent in vain. Still other voices explained why they resisted the draft that followed the initial call for volunteers. Many of those who declined to demonstrate their loyalty, either by answering the questionnaire in a satisfactory way or by reporting for duty if drafted, were sent to the Tule Lake camp or imprisoned in federal penitentiaries. The section Resegregation and Renunciation collects some of their narratives. After Camp is the title of Part 3. Here, we devote one section entitled Resettlement and Reconnection to first-person accounts of return to former homes. Other pieces in this section are by more recent writers, some of whom never experienced the incarceration directly. These Sansei and Yonsei writers build their work on half-told tales and small details to reconnect with their elders' histories. For instance, Brian Comey Dempster recalls the feel of his grandfather's hands, and Christine Catano reflects on what her 16-year-old father remembers packing for camp. The Redress section provides actual and fictionalized accounts of some of the key moments that led to the measure of justice signified by the letter of apology from President George H.W. Bush, which for some meant more than the $20,000 checks issued to surviving incarcerees. Tracy Kato Kiriyama's poem, No Redress, however, takes issue with the government's overdue action, since her grandfather was among those who did not live long enough to receive a check or apology. The final section of the book, Repeating History, gathers recent works that attest to the fact that race-based, federally sanctioned injustice continues in spite of the best efforts of activists and well-meaning civil servants. The book ends, however, with selected pages from the graphic novel We Hereby Refuse that connect resistors of the past with those of the present who declare Never Again Is Now. History repeats itself, but the volume as a whole reminds us that just as there was injustice in the past, there was also resistance. Frank and I hoped that by juxtaposing Japanese-American voices with diverse viewpoints, emotional tenors, and styles of expression, we could provide readers with efficient access to a more textured understanding of the incarceration than most Americans learn in school. The anthology educates not only about the unfolding events and reactions over time, but also about the diversity of those reactions at any given time.